Committee will come to order. Today we are examining the Federal Protective Service and the security of our federal buildings and facilities. FPS, with 1,300 personnel, including law enforcement officers and nearly 14,000 contract guards, is charged with protecting over 9,000 federal buildings and facilities across the nation owned or leased by the General Services Administration. While FPS is not responsible for all federal facilities, its role is central to protecting federal workers and visitors to federal buildings nationwide. Since the 9/11 terrorist attacks, our country has taken steps to prevent and be better prepared for terrorism and other threats. And unfortunately, public buildings are proven targets. Whether because of their symbolism or because of the number of federal employees and visitors that use these facilities, the threat to federal buildings has a long history. In 1995, Timothy McVeigh and his co-conspirators used a truck filled with homemade explosives to bomb the Alfred P. Murrah Federal Building in downtown Oklahoma City, killing 168 people, including 19 children. In 2010, Andrew Stack targeted a building in Austin, Texas, housing 200 IRS employees by crashing a small plane into the building. Active shooter incidents have been an ongoing threat as well, including shootings at the Navy Yard here in Washington, D.C., Fort Hood in Texas, the U.S. Capitol Building, and the United States Holocaust Museum. Because of these clear threats and the steps taken since the Oklahoma City bombing, we should, nearly 20 years later, have significantly improved the security of public buildings. Unfortunately, problems persist. Over the past 5 years, the Government Accountability Office, or GAO, and others continue to identify very real deficiencies. Penetration testing done by the GAO and FPS has revealed fake bomb components, knives, and guns have been secreted past security. The oversight of contract guards and their training needs improvement, and while the guards are armed, they lack training and clear direction on active shooter situations. Partnerships with local law enforcement agencies are patchy, raising questions as to whether state and local law enforcement agencies are clear on their authority to respond to incidents on federal property. The facility risks assessment conducted on federal buildings to help identify their risks and needed security measures are behind schedule and sometimes ignored by customer agencies. And on top of all this, confidence in FPS may be eroding. Just this month, DHS has taken steps to remove FPS from overseeing security at its Nebraska Avenue complex. But we should also put all of this into context. The reality is, building security is difficult. If it were not, these problems would have easily been resolved years ago. We have seen that even with the best security, there is still a risk a terrorist could be successful. And there have been improvements, including FPS's revamping of its risk assessments, improved partnerships with local law enforcement, particularly here in the nation's capital, and a strengthened working relationship with GSA. Today, I hope this can be a productive hearing. We need to understand the challenges and problems, but we also want to hear solutions. Ultimately, whether it's the members of the public or federal workers, those who come to federal buildings must have confidence we are doing all we can to protect them. I look forward to hearing from our witnesses today, and I thank you all for being here. And I'll call on Ranking Member of the Subcommittee, Mr. Carson, for a brief opening statement.
Thank you, Chairman Barletta. I want to thank Chairman Barletta for holding today's hearing. I also want to welcome today's witnesses to the subcommittee hearing on Federal Protective Service. As a former law enforcement officer with over a decade of experience, I have a strong interest in examining FPS and ensuring that it is functioning at the highest possible level. That said, I find the issues facing FPS deeply troubling. FPS is responsible, as we all know, for protecting federal employees and visitors in approximately 9,600 federal facilities across this nation. Yet, the Department of Homeland Security Inspector General and the GAO have issued at least 6 reports since 2009 detailing serious challenges that FPS has been having in meeting this expectation. The shortcomings detailed in these reports are troubling. They effectively highlight that FPS relies on a private contract guard force of over 15,000 guards to provide security to federal facilities under the control of the GSA. The GAO has consistently noted that FPS lacks effective management controls and systems to ensure its contract guards have met their training and certification requirements, which are necessary to ensure a baseline of security in these buildings. In addition, it is unclear whether many of these contract guards have been trained on how to respond to active shooter incidents or use X-ray and magnetometer equipment. These contract guards are often the first line of defense for our federal buildings and the people inside. Now, we must have assurances that they are prepared to offer the highest level of protection. More broadly, GAO has reported that FPS has limited ability to manage risk across federal facilities and implement security countermeasures. FPS lacks a comprehensive strategic approach to providing security to the buildings in GSA's inventory. These problems are worsened by an inability to ensure it has a sufficient amount of law enforcement officers and inspectors necessary to conduct regular security assessments. It is also uncertain whether the current fee structure is sufficient to fund this strong law enforcement presence. Now, we have to be very mindful that federal facilities where federal employees work, particularly the Pentagon, the Navy Yard, and Oklahoma City federal buildings, have been the sites of major attacks. Federal facilities are symbols of our government that terrorists want to take down. But terrorism is not the only threat. We must stay vigilant to protect federal employees and our constituents who visit these buildings on a daily basis. Congress cannot afford to wait for an attack button to push on FPS reform. We are holding this hearing today to help us learn from our stakeholders and our leaders how to better protect millions of federal workers and visitors to these facilities. I thank the witnesses and I thank the chairman. I yield back.
Thank you, Ranking Member Carson. We will have 2 panels today. On our first panel, we have Mr. Mark L. Goldstein, Director, Physical Infrastructure, U.S. Government Accountability Office, and Mr. L. Eric Patterson, Director, Federal Protective Service, Department of Homeland Security. I ask unanimous consent that our witnesses' full statements be included in the record without objection, so ordered. Since your written testimony has been made a part of the record, the subcommittee would request that you limit your oral testimony to 5 minutes. Mr. Goldstein, you may proceed.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and members of the subcommittee. Thank you for the opportunity to be here today and discuss the Federal Protective Service. Recent incidents at federal facilities demonstrate their continued vulnerability to attacks and other acts of violence. As part of DHS, FPS is responsible for protecting federal employees and visitors in approximately 9,600 federal facilities. To help accomplish its mission, FPS conducts facility security assessments and has approximately 13,500 contract security guards deployed to federal facilities. FPS charges fees for its security services to federal tenants. My testimony discusses challenges FPS faces in, number 1, ensuring contract security guards deployed to federal facilities are properly trained and certified, and number 2, conducting risk assessments at federal facilities. It is based on GAO reports issued from 2009 through 2014. As part of our work, we found that the Federal Protective Service continues to face challenges ensuring that contract guards have been properly trained and certified before being deployed to federal facilities around the country. In September 2013, for example, GAO reported that providing training for active shooter scenarios and screening access to federal facilities poses a challenge to FPS. According to officials at 5 guard companies, their contract guards had not received training on how to respond during incidents involving an active shooter. Without ensuring that all guards receive training on how to respond to active shooter incidents, FPS has limited assurance that its guards are prepared for this threat. Similarly, an official from one of FPS's contract guard companies stated that 133 guards, about 38% of its 350 guards on 3 different contracts, had never received screener training. As a result, guards deployed to federal facilities may be using X-ray and magnetometer equipment that they are not qualified to use, raising questions about their ability to fulfill a primary responsibility of screening access control points at federal facilities. GAO was unable to determine the extent to which FPS's guards have received active shooter response and screener training, in part because FPS lacks a comprehensive and reliable system for guard oversight. GAO also found that FPS continues to lack effective management controls to ensure its guards have met its training and certification requirements. For instance, although FPS agreed with GAO's 2012 recommendations that it develop a comprehensive and reliable system for managing information on guards' training, certifications, and qualifications, it still does not have such a system. Additionally, 23% of the 276 contract guard files GAO reviewed did not have required training and certification documentation. For example, some files were missing items such as documentation of screener training, CPR certifications, and firearms qualifications. Additionally, we also found that assessing risk at federal facilities remains a challenge for FPS. GAO found in 2012 that federal agencies pay FPS millions of dollars to assess risks at their facilities, but FPS is not assessing risks in a manner consistent with federal standards. In March 2014, GAO found that this is still a challenge for FPS and several other agencies. The Interagency Security Committee's risk management process for federal facilities standard requires federal agencies to develop risk assessment methodologies that, among other things, assess the threat, vulnerability, and consequence to undesirable events. Risk assessments help decision makers identify and evaluate security risks and implement protective measures. Instead of conducting risk assessments, FPS uses an interim vulnerability assessment tool referred to as the Modified Infrastructure Survey Tool, or MIST, to assess federal facilities until it develops a longer-term solution. However, MIST does not assess consequence, the level, duration, and nature of potential loss resulting from an undesirable event. 3 of the 4 risk assessment experts GAO spoke to agreed that a tool that does not estimate consequence does not allow agencies to fully assess risks. The FPS has limited knowledge of the risk facing about 9,600 federal facilities around the country as a result. FPS officials stated to us that consequence information in MIST was not part of the original design of the system, but they are exploring ways to incorporate it now. Finally, I would note that since fiscal year 2010, GAO has made 31 recommendations to improve FPS's contract guard and risk assessment processes, of which 6 have been implemented, 10 are in process, and 15 have not been implemented. Mr. Chairman, this concludes my oral statement. I'd be happy to respond to questions that you members of the subcommittee have. Thank you very much.
Thank you for your testimony, Mr. Goldstein. Mr. Patterson, you may proceed.
Thank you, Chairman Barletta, Ranking Member Carson, and distinguished members of the committee. My name is Eric Patterson, and I am the Director of the Federal Protective Service within the National Protection and Programs Directorate of the Department of Homeland Security. I am honored to testify before the committee today regarding the mission and operations of the Federal Protective Service. FPS is charged with protecting and delivering integrated law enforcement and security services to more than 9,000 facilities owned or leased by the General Services Administration and safeguarding more than 1.4 million daily occupants and visitors. In performing this mission, FPS directly employs more than 1,000 sworn federal law enforcement officers to provide uniformed police response at FPS protected facilities, participate in joint tactical exercises with various federal, state, local, and tribal law enforcement personnel, and conduct facility security assessment of FPS protected facilities nationwide. Utilizing the Modified Infrastructure Survey Tool, or MIST, our inspectors document the existing protective posture at a facility, compare how a facility is or is not meeting the baseline of protection for its facility security level, and provide recommendations to tenant facility security committees regarding appropriate countermeasures to mitigate the risk. FPS designed its FSA process to meet the requirements of the Interagency Security Committee's risk management process for federal facilities, and FPS is in the process of submitting the FSA process, including the MIST tool, to the ISC for validation. Utilizing this tool, FPS is on track to have completed assessments at all FSL Level 3 through 5 facilities in the FPS portfolio by the end of calendar year 2014. I am also pleased to report that the second generation tool, MIST 2.0, is currently in systems acceptance testing. This system will feature, among other improvements, an enhanced user interface and improved visibility and protection measures across the FPS portfolio. At this time, we expect deployment of this system to begin in the fall of 2014. FPS inspectors also oversee guard posts staffed by approximately 13,000 FPS contracted protective security officers. PSOs are responsible for controlling access to federal facilities, detecting and reporting criminal acts, and responding to emergency situations. PSOs also ensure prohibited items such as firearms, explosives, knives, and drugs do not enter federal facilities. All PSOs must undergo background investigation checks to determine their fitness to begin work on behalf of the government and are rigorously trained. However, it is important to note that PSOs are not sworn law enforcement officers. Rather, PSOs are employees of private security companies, and FPS does not have the authority to deputize PSOs in a law enforcement capability. An individual's PSO's authority to perform protective services are based on state-specific laws where the PSO is employed. FPS partners with private sector guard companies to ensure that the guards have met the certification, training, and qualification requirements specified in the contracts. Additionally, FPS is working closely with the National Association of Security Companies to develop a national lesson plan for PSOs that will establish a basic and national training program for all PSOs to ensure standards are consistent across the nation. These efforts will further standardize training PSOs receive and will provide for great capability to validate training and facilitate rapid adjustments to training to account for changes in threat and technological advancements. To ensure high performance of our contract PSO workforce, FPS law enforcement personnel conduct PSO post-inspections and integrated covert test activities to monitor vendor compliance and countermeasure effectiveness. Additionally, vendor personnel files are audited periodically to validate that PSO certifications and training records reflect compliance and contract requirements. To supplement this current audit process, FPS has partnered with science and technology to develop a prototype post-tracking system. This system will be capable of authenticating an individual's PSO's identity and tracking PSO time on position and training and certification records in real time. We expect the first iteration of this system to begin testing within 12 months. We continuously strive to further enhance, integrate, and transform our organization to meet the challenges of an evolving threat landscape and are committed to closing out outstanding Government Accountability Office recommendations pertaining to FPS operations. To facilitate the closure of open GAO recommendations, FPS has implemented a program management approach. Utilizing this process, FPS has closed 2 open GAO recommendations this year and expects to submit documentation for closure of 8 additional GAO recommendations by the end of June 2014. In total, FPS hopes to close 10 to 15 of the 31 open GAO recommendations before the end of this fiscal year. In closing, I would like to acknowledge and thank the distinguished members of this committee for the opportunity to testify today. The Federal Protective Service remains committed to its mission of providing safety, security, and a sense of well-being to thousands of visitors and federal employees who work and conduct business in our facilities daily. I would be pleased to answer any questions you may have. Thank you.
Thank you for your testimony, Mr. Patterson. I will now begin the first round of questions, limited to 5 minutes for each member. If there are additional questions following the first round, we will have additional rounds of questions as needed. The Federal Protection Service is directly responsible for protecting federal buildings and the 1.4 million workers and visitors to those facilities. The Public Buildings Act, crafted by this committee, gave FPS law enforcement authorities for that very purpose, to protect buildings and the people in them. Yet after moving from GSA to DHS in 2003, there has been a GAO report after report detailing serious security deficiencies at federal facilities. Given the importance of this mission, one would expect the Department of Homeland Security to make federal building security a top priority. Yet, these problems continue. Just recently, we received a copy of a May 1st memo from the DHS Security Officer, Chief Security Officer, to the DHS Undersecurity for Management that removed the Federal Protection Service from its lead role of providing security at the Homeland Security Headquarters complex on Nebraska Avenue. Well, my first question, Mr. Patterson, is why was the Federal Protection Service removed as the lead security provider at the DHS headquarters? And does this mean that DHS has lost confidence in FPS?
To answer your question, sir, to my knowledge, this was not an issue of performance. Okay, and I do not believe that the department has lost confidence in the Federal Protective Service. I believe this was an issue of efficiency and unity of command that is supporting the Secretary's vision. And in effect, FPS will continue to provide security, which will include law enforcement, canine support. We will continue to do assessments, and we'll have a robust presence at the facility as we always have. So currently, this is really about the contract management and not about losing confidence in our ability to provide security and law enforcement support. FPS supports 2,100 DHS facilities across the nation, to include the ICE headquarters, FEMA headquarters, CBP headquarters, Secret Service headquarters, TSA, and the U.S. Coast Guard headquarters. So, and we do a very good job there. We have a robust presence there, and I'm sure we will continue to provide the same level of support to the NAC. Bottom line is we are proactive partners with the Office of Security, ensuring we provide a safe and secure environment at the NAC.
What were the problems at the Department of Homeland Security headquarters that caused the Chief Security Officer to take this action, and are there similar problems at the other 9,600 federal buildings FPS provides security for? And finally, could you explain why FPS security is inadequate for DHS, but good enough for the other agencies?
Yes, sir. I don't think this is an indictment of FPS security. I think, again, this is a matter of efficiency in managing a contract, and less about we are going to continue to provide security at the NAC. That's not the issue. This is, again, as the Office of Security, I believe, is looking to fulfill the Secretary's vision of how they will streamline and better conduct business at the NAC.
Today, who is in charge of security at the DHS headquarters? And if there were an active shooter incident right now, who would be the incident commander on scene? And will the first responders know who is in charge? What would be the role of FPS in that situation?
Yes, sir. In that situation, the Office of Security and the Federal Protective Service share a partnership. So it could be either the Office of Security or it could be the Federal Protective Service. It just depends on who is first on scene. That's who's going to assume incident command of the situation, and then it will evolve from there. We will look to, at that point, bring in the Metropolitan Police Department and other support to help us in resolving that situation.
Mr. Goldstein, what percentage of security guards has active shooter training? What percentage has security screener training? And if security guards do not have proper training, how would you expect them to be able to keep weapons and bombs out of a federal building or respond to an active shooter?
Mr. Chairman, our study was not generalizable, so I can't say for sure how many actually do have that kind of screening today. However, what we found in looking at in talking to several different guard companies around the country was that there are still pockets of guards that do not. Several years ago, when we did this kind of work, we found that there were 1,500 guards in several regions that did not have screener training. For the companies we looked at now, there were still several hundred that do not, and we would expect that there would be others, although, as I say, it's not generalizable. However, because of this problem persisting and the lack of training that is required being actually provided, we do have concerns that remain and that have remained for a number of years now, as you know, about the ability and possibility of bombs and other kinds of weapons getting into federal facilities, because there is no assurance that the person standing guard and responsible for putting things through a magnetometer and an X-ray machine has the adequate training to prevent something from coming through that shouldn't come through.
Thank you. Chair now recognizes Ranking Member Carson for questions.
Thank you. Thank you, Chairman. Director Patterson, how often does the FPS fine and penalize contract guard companies for posting guards who do not have the proper certification or incomplete training?
I don't have that statistic readily available for you, sir. I'd have to get that to you.
Yes, sir.
That would be resident with our contracting office.
Yes, sir. Director Patterson, based on the status quo, sir, how would you expect contract guards to react to a Navy Yard type shooting or a GSA control facility?
Yes, sir. One of the things we are doing now, we are working aggressively with the National Association of Security Companies, NASCO, and looking at, given the current laws, if you will, how we can work with the security guard companies to respond. Currently, we have just produced some guidance to provide each one of the security guards 2 hours of active shooter training. But what that really does for us, it makes them aware of what an active shooter event is, all right? And that individual will have the discretion, given the circumstance, at that point to actively pursue, depending upon, again, what the circumstances are, because each one of these companies is still under the oversight of their state law. So we're kind of caught between a rock and a hard place right now. We would like to be able to train them to a standard to where that we can give them active shooter training and move them to a position to where there's no question, okay? But right now, because we don't have that authority, it creates a little bit of a dilemma.
Thank you, Director. Mr. Goldstein, in your testimony, sir, you discussed the fact that FPS is using MIST, a vulnerability assessment tool that does not take into account the consequences of an undesirable attack or an event. What is the impact of assessing the consequences of a terrorist attack or serious crime activities at a federal facility?
The ISC standard requires that agencies look at threat, that they look at vulnerability, and they look at consequence, and they look at a list of a number of undesirable events. And then for each of those undesirable events, they are required to determine whether there is a threat, vulnerability, and consequent component of all of those events. In our work, we have found that examination of consequence is important because it helps to determine how best to protect a facility. Because we're talking, obviously, about limited resources, and we're talking about trying to protect, in this case, some 9,600 facilities. But because of the way in which the federal government and FPS actually look at each building, it's kind of a cookie-cutter approach. And there is no, and I've said this a number of times here and elsewhere before this committee, there is no way that FPS is able to examine threats, vulnerability, and consequences across its portfolio to target resources best across facilities. It looks at each facility in a stovepipe kind of way, and therefore it becomes quite difficult to better provide resources which are, as we all know, quite limited to FPS.
Mr. Goldstein, what is the value in FPS individual facility securities assessments currently, and are these assessments thorough enough to properly assess the threat to federal employees and visitors to federal buildings, and how could current assessments even be improved for that matter?
It's our understanding that since MIST has been in place, which is about 18 months or so, that FPS has once again begun to do assessments, that they've done around 1,200 based on the information we have. But they had a backlog when they started MIST of about 5,000. So that's still a pretty considerable number that hadn't been done just from the past. And at level 3 and level 4 buildings, they're expected to be done roughly every 3 years. So there's quite a lot of backlog that remains, as well as pent-up demand for new ones. And when we've gone in and looked as well, about 9 or 10% of them, hundreds of them, thousands of them really, didn't even have a date associated with them of when the last assessment was. So it's hard to know just how long it's been since many major federal buildings have actually had a risk assessment to start with. We also know that in the last couple of years that a number of other federal agencies have done their own assessments, even while they're paying FPS to do a separate assessment. So there's a lot of duplication. And the IRS and the EPA and many other agencies have done their own assessments for a whole variety of reasons, including that Some didn't like the standard to which it was being done. Some didn't like what was being shared with them. And so there's been a variety of reasons for that as well. So there has been a lot of duplication also. We do believe that FPS has to do a better job, and hopefully MIS2, which Director Patterson has talked about, will help them achieve that in being able to allow them to do better assessments in the future.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Chair now recognizes Mr. Crawford for 5 minutes of questioning.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Patterson, I think the chairman addressed this earlier, this memo from Greg Marshall, Chief Security Officer, regarding the Nebraska Avenue complex. And if I understand it correctly, what you said was that it was essentially a command and control issue. It wasn't necessarily anything related otherwise. Is that accurate?
Yes, sir. To my knowledge, yes, sir.
I'm curious, on a facility with that level of security, can you describe, I'm concerned about the proliferation of IEDs in federal buildings being a target. Can you describe what is the protocol, the response protocol in the event of an IED detection or a large-scale IED attack?
Well, first of all, folks who are visitors who are coming have to go through screening. And if at that point there is a detection that we believe that there is an explosive device, that area is cleared, we will then call at that point the Metropolitan Police Department, who will bring in their explosive detection team to assess whether or not it is truly an explosive device or not. If they in fact assess that it is an explosive device, then the emergency evacuation plans for that facility will then be put into place.
Okay, I'm concerned about what and I've had some talks with other Metro bomb squads and some of the federal agencies that are also equipped or staffed with bomb techs. In the event of a large scale, do you have anything beyond just relying on Metro bomb squad, or are there some other federal agencies that might respond as a backup?
Yes, sir. Because we're in the Washington, D.C., we can believe that the FBI is going to respond. The Metropolitan Police Department is going to respond. We're probably going to have Park Services respond. So there's going to be a significant response. The challenge is, if we're talking about an explosive device, we probably want to at least limit the scope of the response until we decide, the magnitude of the threat.
Does FPS have any capacity, any kind of technical capacity to deal with an IED? And that is to say, are there bomb techs within the ranks of FPS?
No, sir. We don't have bomb techs, but we do have explosive ordnance dogs that we use. That's our first line of defense. If we suspect that there is an issue, we will bring in the K9 to give us an alert. And if they alert, then clearly we begin to evacuate that area, and then that's when we call in the Metropolitan Police Department and others who have the capability to further explore what the issue is.
Okay, so and then outside of D.C., I would assume that there is a similar protocol in place with local municipalities that have the capacity to respond to an IED threat?
Absolutely, sir, yes. If an FPS dog isn't available, we have relationships with local law enforcement where we can leverage their assets as well. If in fact we get a positive hit, then we call on, if it's a city of Chicago, we'll call on the city of Chicago. If it's a smaller city, then whatever arrangements have been made for a response, and that's who we'll call on.
Do you have any relationships with DoD assets? And by that, what I'm getting at here is that, for example, the United States Army has the primary responsibility of providing support to law enforcement at every level within the continental United States. Do you have those arrangements in place with the DoD assets?
We have a relationship with them to where we can call on them if we need them.
Okay.
Yes, sir.
Appreciate that. Oh, one other thing. You said you had detection dogs.
Yes, sir.
So that means you have handlers that have been trained and
Yes, sir. We've got about 70, 74, 75 canines with their handlers across the United States, and there's we have one up at the Nebraska Avenue complex for about 18 hours during the day.
Okay. Mr. Goldstein, what percentage of federal buildings has up-to-date and complete security risk assessments?
It's not possible to say, sir, at this point in time. As I mentioned, there's a considerable backlog at this point of past due assessments, plus the work we've done in the past show that because there are a number of them that have no date in the system at all. It's not possible to determine when the last one was done. They are working, FPS is working to reduce that backlog and to hopefully move forward with new ones so that they can become up to date, but they're not at that place today.
Wow, that's kind of disturbing. So why the backlog?
The backlog occurred over a period of time for a couple of reasons. One, that the old system that was being used, called RAMP, its functionality was not sufficient, and they pulled the plug on the program, and so then a backlog, began to grow. Additionally, I think over time, as the Federal Protective Service changed the nature of its workforce from a police officer force to an integrated force of inspectors that had a lot of different duties, that this particular responsibility of doing the assessment, which fell on them and which many of them were not trained for, took up an increasing amount of time, but they had other duties as well, including managing contract guards and the contract guard contracts and other things. And so they fell behind, quite frankly.
Is this not part of an annual review? I mean, it seems to me that ought to be something done annually to make sure that that assessment is up to date all the time.
It should be done on a level 3 and level 4 building every 3 years, but as I mentioned, it's simply not occurring at this point in time.
All right, my time's expired. I'll yield back. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you. Chair now recognizes Ms. Norton for 5 minutes of questioning.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I very much appreciate this hearing. There have been chronic problems at FPS, and I'd like to look at the difference between FPS officers and contract guards so that we understand who is really guarding these buildings. On page 2 of your testimony, you describe the law enforcement authority of FPS officers, specific police powers, including enforcing federal laws and regulations, carrying firearms, etc. Then, of course, on page 5 of your testimony, you distinguish these officers from the contract guards who, and this is very important, I think, to just lay right here on the record, it's in your testimony, the PSOs rely on private person laws such as citizen arrest laws. So that means that they can do no more than I can do in a federal building. I mean, isn't that technically correct?
Yes, ma'am. They are governed by the state law as to the extent of their authority.
All right. So, were the Nebraska Avenue contract guards replaced by Federal Protective Service officers?
No, ma'am, they were not.
What is at Nebraska Avenue now?
Contract protective security officers.
So what was the difference? What was the change?
I'm sorry.
What was the change at Nebraska Avenue?
Oh, the change was in the oversight of the contract. FPS was oversighting the contract. We had core responsibilities, contract officer representative responsibilities. That's the day-to-day oversight of the contract. How the contract's executed,
FPS is supervising or an oversight over these guards at the Department of Homeland Security on Nebraska Avenue?
We were. Now that particular responsibility has been now moved to the Office of Security.
And that is unique then. Only at the Department of Homeland Security does that arrangement ensue?
No, ma'am, only at the Nebraska Avenue complex. We still retain that responsibility at hundreds of DHS facilities around the country.
So I won't ask you to tell us why. I think we'd have to ask the department, but I think it's pretty apparent why. They obviously felt they had to be made more secure, and they went to professional security authorities. Now, when FPS guards who guard all the rest of the buildings and the federal employees and the visitors, if someone comes into one of those facilities and has a gun, with or without a gun, and decides not to go through the magnometer, can a contract guard pursue that person?
Yes, ma'am, and they can be detained. At that point, they will call the FPS Mega Center, who will then dispatch either a FPS inspector or the local authorities.
I ask that because there have been instances reported where contract guards stood by, not when someone had a gun, but when there was a disturbance, saying they could not leave their post.
Every day, ma'am, we have contract guards who are engaged in responding to disturbances, especially at Social Security offices. I mean, we have literally hundreds of them that happen every year. So contract guards.
The contract guard is not pinned on the post. He can go anywhere in the facility where there may be a disturbance. He can pursue someone with a gun, even though he does not have a gun.
I'm not sure that I understand what your question is, ma'am.
Someone comes through.
Right.
And remember, what you're there for is for surprises, not for the average person coming through. All right, someone comes through with a gun.
Yes, ma'am.
I'm trying to find out whether the contract guard who has no gun can pursue that person.
Well, our contract
or what
guard,
he must do.
Yes, ma'am. Our contract guards are armed, and if they see the individual,
All of them are armed?
they are armed. Yes, ma'am.
Is there a central curriculum for how they are trained?
Yes, ma'am.
Who provides that curriculum?
We do. We lay out the requirements for the training, and we are currently in development of a national training program for training that we're working with NASCO to employ.
Well, my time is up, so I yield back for the moment.
Thank you. We'll now begin our second round of questionings, and I'll open with a question to Mr. Patterson. Clearly, FPS does not have enough federal law enforcement officers to respond to all federal buildings in a timely manner. You have to rely on contract guards as your first line of defense. Yet you noted in your testimony that the authority of contract guards to use deadly force comes from state and local laws, and that in most cases they do not have the authority to pursue subjects. In order to address the threat posed by active shooters, would it be helpful for FPS to have the authority to delegate some federal law enforcement authorities to contract guards? And do other agencies have this ability? And how does it work in those cases?
Yes, sir. If we look across the spectrum of the authorities, if you look at TSA, you know, that's a federalized force. If you look at the U.S. Marshal Service, they have the authority to deputize, which gives them extensive power to direct their workforce in just about any direction that they want. Then you have the Department of Energy, who has a guard force protecting the nuclear plants and other facilities, where they have some limited law enforcement authorities that allow them to arrest and do the things that they need to be done on an immediate basis. What we would seek would be to streamline our PSO authority structure. And what that means is that to give us an opportunity that when we needed to increase the authority of the PSO, we can. For instance, during Hurricane Sandy, our response to Hurricane Sandy, we were being requested to provide extensive support to the folks in New York and our facilities in New York. Our vendor quickly ran out of resources to provide to that situation, to that event. We then began to query our other vendors to see if they could help with that response. And what we found was that we had to go through the state of New York approval process, which took quite a bit of time, wherein if we had had the authority to just more or less empower them at the federal level to go in to do that, then we could have done this more quickly in response. So it would help improve. We could also help improve the PSO training, because now we could directly provide focused training on the areas that we would want them to respond in, and it would also help with the FPS mission readiness. So yes, sir, anything of that nature would be of help.
In some areas where FPS does not have many law enforcement personnel, FPS relies on state and local law enforcement to be the first responders to a federal facility in the event of an emergency. Do these state and local law enforcement personnel have all of the authorities and tools that they need to respond to an incident at a federal facility? And do you have agreements in place with the relevant state and local authorities to ensure that they respond accordingly?
From time to time, sir, we do have a problem. If we're responding, if there is an impromptu demonstration, especially in some of our smaller cities and towns, if there is an impromptu demonstration or a national security event that may take place, we may ask the local law enforcement folks to assist us. In some instances, their response is, you know, we can't respond. We would love to respond to you, but we don't want to be held liable for anything. This is a federal event, and we don't have that authority. So if we were able to provide that authority and say, listen, you are now functioning or acting on behalf of the federal government, that would clearly give them some relief, if you will, on their willingness to help us.
There have been some concerns about FPS's staffing levels for some time. In fact, language carried in the appropriations bills have required a minimum staffing level. You only have 1,300 employees, but we understand that up to 40 of those employees may have been reassigned to functions outside of FPS. Is that correct? And how many FPS employees have been assigned outside of FPS, and why?
Yes, sir. Well, you know, when we left ICE and we came to NPPD, we lacked the infrastructure for things like human resources and logistics and those things. So clearly, we had to come up with some staffing levels for that, and that's what we have contributed to. That's the benefit that we derive when we contribute these assets to NPPD as they help us through our in creating our infrastructure, if you will.
Mr. Goldstein, given the number of outstanding work items at FPS, can FPS afford to assign its employees to other parts of the department?
That's probably not a question I can directly answer because we haven't looked at where they're assigned and what the rationale for those assignments are. But it's clear that FPS still struggles with trying to get the basic job done that we've talked about here this morning in terms of risk assessments, in terms of contract guard oversight, and the things that you have brought up, sir. So I do think that's something they need to look at routinely.
Chair now recognizes Ranking Member Carson.
Thank you very much, Chairman. Thank you. Mr. Goldstein, are you aware of any of the shelf technology that would effectively allow the FPS to digitize their oversight of contract guard certifications and trainings? And do you believe that this technology would allow FPS to improve their oversight of contract guards immediately?
We haven't looked specifically at it, but in the course of our work, we've been told by many people that there is off-the-shelf products that could readily do this job and that FPS does not have to reinvent the wheel.
Director Patterson, you know, sir, federal law requires that FPS have just over 1,000 law enforcement officers. How many law enforcement officers does FPS actually need to meet its mission? And has FPS prepared a report that indicates that based on an activity-based cost model for human capital that FPS needs significantly more law enforcement officers, and what might that number be just generally?
Yes, sir. We have looked at that, and given the circumstances of today, when we did this, when we did the assessment, it's about 1,300 law enforcement that would give us the proper leveling, if you will, for the commitment that we have today. But as that commitment grows, that absolutely that figure will change.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Chair now recognizes Ms. Norton.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to pursue that 1,300 figure. How many FPS officers are there, and how many contract guards are there?
Yes, ma'am. Today we have 1,000 sworn law enforcement FPS officers, and there are the contract guard force fluctuates depending upon the requirements, but today there are about 13,000.
Have budget cuts or the sequester had any effect upon contract guards or FPS officers? Have there been a reduction in personnel, for example, in the last 2 years?
No, ma'am. Actually, there has not been a reduction of the FPS staff, but there was sequestration did have an impact on the contract guard force in that when buildings closed, there was no requirement for contract guards. As such, we did not have to.
But most buildings didn't close.
There were many buildings that did close, ma'am. And
But those who didn't close were, let me ask you this, were FPS officers sequestered? I mean, sorry, were FPS officers put on furloughs?
No, ma'am. No FPS personnel were put on furlough.
And contract guards were affected when buildings closed, but otherwise they were on duty.
Yes, ma'am.
I'd like to ask you, Mr. Goldstein, about the supervision at committees, because you spoke about a cookie-cutter approach, cross-agency or cross-cutting agency approach to security, but agency by agency security. Now, these agencies each have committees. Now, these committees, of course, consist of personnel who are no more than the people who work in the building, and none of them have any security background, training, or knowledge. Is that not the case?
Yes, ma'am, that's correct.
But they have some significant responsibility for security in buildings. Would you describe the role of these lay people in security?
Yes, ma'am. We've done some work. It's a couple of years old now, but it takes a look at the facility security committees, and it explains that the individuals who make up those committees, as you rightly said, tend to be the tenants of the building, and the tenant that has the largest footprint in the building typically chairs that committee. I've gone to, and my staff has gone to, a number of facility security committee meetings over the years, and they do tend to be made up of lay people. They tend to be, for instance, perhaps the administrative assistant or office manager for a specific agency, people like that. It tends to be, frankly, a delegated job that many people don't really want.
And so what is it that they have to do with security?
They are responsible for taking the information provided them by the Federal Protective Service in making decisions about what kinds of countermeasures they're going to put in place, and then going back to their home agencies to get the necessary funds for doing this. So this is, as you know, a process that could take a number of years.
Of course, through what expertise can they recommend changes in security and get the funds for that? I mean,
they rely on the expertise generally that's provided by the FPS, as well as they may call on their own security people from their agencies or departments to assist them. But the problem, as we've described it, is you have the security of federal buildings essentially being decided by a lot of lay people over a very long period of time, when countermeasures may need to be put in place, fairly rapidly.
Mr. Chairman, I think one of the most I believe these security committees or agency committees are central points of vulnerability. Obviously, when you're talking to someone who says he represents the head of the agency, and he says, for example, I'll take the Department of Transportation. I know this only by chance. The Department of Transportation is close to this very Capitol. If you go to the Department of Transportation, you have to get someone in the Department of Transportation to come down, even if you have a badge from the United States Congress. If you are a member of the public, you can't get into that public building at all. Of course, if you're a member of the public, you can come into the Capitol. You can use our cafeteria. The Department of Transportation is a beautiful new building with a new cafeteria, and we haven't figured out a way for the public that paid for that building to be able to come in if they have a kid to use the laboratory. Can't get into that building. And that has everything to do with these agency committees. Mr. Goldstone, do you believe these committees are appropriate as the decision makers on how much security is needed for a specific building so that you can have vast differences between the Capitol and the Department of Transportation, for example?
The Interagency Security Committee recently put out some draft standards, which is going to help to hopefully better professionalize these committees. But we have long had concerns that this kind of, I call it a three-legged stool. GSA has some responsibility, FPS has some responsibility, and the individual facility security committees have some responsibility, that may not be appropriate today as a way to direct and oversee the security of federal property.
This is, I think, an important issue for this agency to secure. Nobody's in charge if there are three possible people in charge, and I submit that these agency committees of lay people are who are really in charge of security in buildings, not the FPS and not the contract guards. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Chair now recognizes former chair of the Transportation Committee, Mr. Michael.
Thank you, Mr. Barletta, and thank you for holding this important hearing and following up and looking at the Federal Protective Services and making certain that our federal facilities are secure. Important responsibility. A couple of questions. First of all, Mr. Patterson, threats still remain, and probably one of the most devastating most devastating attacks I can recall is the McVeigh bombing of in Oklahoma. I think more than likely, now that was a domestic terrorist act, but international terrorist act, we see the use of bombs, the Boston bombing. We're probably overdue for another hit because you can get a lot of explosives and create explosive devices fairly easily, as we've seen. How often are you briefed on intelligence and what? Who briefs you? So, can you tell the committee who you're getting your intelligence information from, and then how often are you meeting with those folks?
Yes, sir, I can. Within the Federal Protective Service, we are really beginning to build a very structured intelligence apparatus, intelligence gathering apparatus.
But again, there are agencies that do that.
No, I'm just saying how we collect it, sir. What I'm saying is that what we do is we've got our folks who are assigned to the Joint Terrorism Task Force with the FBI.
How often? So you're getting most of your intelligence from the Joint Task Force of the FBI?
Oh, no, sir. That's what I was going to say. We're getting it from a variety of resources.
Okay, tell me
right,
who.
Sir. Right.
Who?
So I'll start at the lower level at the fusion centers from the state's fusion centers.
From states?
Yes, sir. We get it from state.
How
fusion
often
centers.
do you meet with them?
Well, our folks meet with them every day.
Okay.
So
federal?
Federal, from the FBI and from the Defense Department, from all of the federal, and in fact, from the Intelligence and Analysis Centers at the Department of Homeland Security.
How often do they meet?
We talk to them every day.
Every day?
Every day, yes, sir.
And how is that information? Now, the bulk of your people are contract people, 15,000. How is that information delegated? Now, you don't get to every one of the 15,000, but someone in the chain has to be made aware that a certain threat, a risk, is occurring, and make people aware of what we're looking for, who, what.
Yes, sir. What we do is immediately, once we receive a threat, that information is in package in a way that we can communicate that, because quite often, depending upon what the threat is, it may be classified. And if it's classified, then we'll have to figure out how we can get it down to our lowest level. And
you have 1,000 LEOs, I
yes,
guess? Yeah.
Yes, sir.
And are they at each location? Is there someone at each location?
No, sir. They're not.
But there's someone who can get the information.
Yes, sir. We electronically we can get those to our folks as well as the.
How often are some kind of warnings put out? Daily, weekly, monthly, periodically?
It just depends.
Sporadically? Okay.
Yes, sir. It depends.
All right. It would be good if you could give us a little chain of the command, who you meet with and when, just for the record. I'd like to see it as part of the record, if you could.
Sure.
And how you meet with them, because I think that most of what's happened, we still have, we still are not able to connect the dots. We didn't connect the dots with the Boston.
Right.
We haven't connected the dots at all. And it's usually local law enforcement and others who are
Absolutely,
are at the final scene. But again, the deficit in intelligent information is what's going to do us in. Okay,
if I might,
that's what I want to know for the history of the committee. Then I see you have a mass of dogs. How many dogs for explosive detection?
I think it's about 74 today.
Oh, I thought you had thousands.
No, sir.
Is that contract 2 dogs or just?
No, that's just.
Oh, you don't?
No.
Then I don't see a lot of explosive detection devices at some of these checkpoints in the federal buildings. I see the metal detectors, which are useless when it comes. The biggest threat right now is explosives. Okay.
Right. Yes, sir.
But I don't see a lot of them. Do you have a lot of them out there?
No, not explosive detection devices. No, sir. What we do is.
See, I think you're missing the boat there.
Yeah.
And I think that's where our threat is. Then finally, I guess we let others over a little bit, but you have 1,000 LEOs. Do they participate in live fire testing, training?
Sir. Yes, sir.
Okay. Do you use simulation?
We don't use simulation.
Okay. I want a report back. I want to know why you're not using simulation. It's more cost effective. You can train them to the highest levels possible. We use it for our military. None of your guys are in combat. I haven't seen a lot of firing of weapons on the scene. Our military are on the scene in combat, and a good portion of their training now comes from simulation. You are behind the times. I want to report back to the committee and to me on your proposal to use simulation for training those LOs and stop using all the expensive, costly live fire ammunition.
May I ask you can I clarify, sir?
Go ahead.
Are we talking about simunitions? Is that? I just want to make sure I get the
well,
right
using simulation, training, weapons training, situation training, the whole thing.
We do have weapons training where we do simulating training, but we don't use simunitions. Okay, simunitions is what I'm talking about. Is where we take where the officer will have devices that are strapped to him, and when another officer fires a weapon, it will tell whether there's a hit or not.
Okay, well,
we don't use that, but we do simulated training to where we.
I want to see exactly what you have.
Okay.
Give us a full report, and then I want to see what your new proposal is, and we can introduce you to people in simulation training, which we've used for our military and manpower readiness. Very, very cost effective. It'll save you a lot of those expensive bullets. You'll back the balance of my.
Thank you. The chair now recognizes Mr. Mark Wayne.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Patterson, we have obviously had a lot of discussion here on human resource and the management by the FBS. But you guys are also responsible for managing relating equipment such as security cameras. Is that
Yes,
correct?
Sir. Yes, sir.
Well, the way I understand it is there's indications that some cameras may not be working, and there's also no mechanism to track and maintain these cameras. Is that correct too?
No, sir. We do track and maintain cameras. We're developing a more robust system to do that more effectively. But we actually do every time that we go out and conduct a facility security assessment. We are tracking that when our inspectors go out and visit their facilities, they are also looking and inspecting cameras and
what type of expense has FBS acquired or cured by these cameras? The installation, the purchasing, and install of them.
Those are all paid for by the FSC, the building, the participant or the folks who occupy the facility.
So what percentage of the cameras do you guys go out and check? And I say this because I have several companies on my phone right now. I have an app where I can hit and I can check in all my companies because the security cameras that we have around there. It's a very it's an unbelievable asset when utilized correctly.
Yes, sir.
when utilized
Right.
correctly. But it's also a huge personal expense that our companies had to take on.
Right.
But the cameras are worthless if they're not being tracked, if they're not being watched, and a percentage of those isn't 10%, it's not 5%, but it's 100% of them. They're all installed for a purpose. So what percentage does FPS actually look at?
Now, when you say we FPS...
When you're tracking them, when you're looking at them, when you're maintaining them, when you're making sure they're even working.
Yes, sir.
What percentage of that? Are you saying you just when you go visit the facility?
No, sir. We're about the business of ensuring that all of the cameras work, and when they don't work, then we move forward to work with the facility security committee to, in fact, either fix the cameras or replace the cameras.
I guess what I'm trying to get to is, are you actively seeking these?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, we want to ensure that the cameras are working. You are exactly right. A camera is ineffective, or our security becomes less effective if, in fact, the cameras aren't operating.
Mr. Goldstein, what about with JO and the cameras that you guys have?
We've taken a look at some of the cameras over time that FPS has. We've done work in which we have shown that a number of facilities have not had adequate cameras, and FPS was unable to determine when crimes had been committed, who committed those crimes perhaps, when things were taken out of the building. We also know of a number of instances where other tenants, particularly the courts, have become quite frustrated with the Federal Protective Service because they did not feel that maintenance of the cameras was sufficient, and they took over those responsibilities and paid for them themselves. I continue to hear anecdotally, we have not done a comprehensive report, so it's not generalizable, but we do hear anecdotes all the time about frustrations with keeping these cameras working and modernized.
Mr. Goldstein, you're saying the same thing that this committee has heard too. And Mr. Patterson, that was what I was trying to get at, the frustration behind it. We have technology that's out there, and it's not being utilized. And the tenants, these buildings, the ones that are depending on these cameras, that's supposed to have a layer of security. Instead, it's becoming a layer of frustration. And there is a better way to do things. And I would be curious if you guys could, or if you would, take a look at it.
Yes, sir.
See if there's a better practice. Just the way that we're doing it, just spot checking it, just going through it. Obviously, you just heard from Mr. Goldstein. The committee has heard the same things, that there's a layer of frustration that's taking place.
Yes, sir. And I recognize there is a layer of frustration. I spend quite a bit of time on the road talking to the clerks of the courts, to IRS, Social Security.
Mr. Patterson,
Yes,
the difference between talking and doing is two different things.
No,
There's a lot of people over there who give lip service. What we're asking for is service.
Yes, sir, and I'm not giving lip service. I am giving service. I am ensuring that when folks are dissatisfied or not happy with our service, that we are rendering service that we're supposed to. So, sir, respectfully, I'm not giving lip service.
Well, I would hope that maybe next time we visit, we can see a plan that's laid out.
Yes, sir.
Because I would like to think that we could improve on this.
Yes, sir.
Okay. Thank you, sir. Mr. Chairman, I appreciate you giving me the extra time.
Thank you. We'll have one final round of questions. Mr. Patterson, the law enforcement authority for the FPS lies in the Public Buildings Act. It is our understanding that this authority has been redelegated to other entities such as the Chief Security Office, FEMA, ICE, the Federal Law Enforcement Training Center. Why is this law enforcement authority being delegated across DHS, and isn't this FPS's responsibility? Didn't this delegation of authority create the unity of command problem at the headquarters that DHS cited as the reason from removing FPS as the security lead at the headquarters?
Sir, I don't have an answer for you. I don't know why the different agencies or different elements have been granted that authority. I don't have an answer.
Well, this will conclude our first panel. I'd like to thank both for your testimony today and for your time and cooperation. Thank you. We'll now call on our second panel. On our second panel, we have Mr. David L. Wright, President, AFGE Local 918, and Mr. Stephen Amante, Executive Director and General Counsel, National Association of Security Companies. I ask unanimous consent that our witnesses' full statements be included in the record. Without objection, so ordered. Since your written testimony has been made a part of the record, the subcommittee would request that you limit your oral testimony to 5 minutes. Mr. Wright, you may proceed.
Thank you, Chairman. Chairman Barletta, Ranking Member Carson, members of the committee. My name is David Wright. I'm president of AFGE Local 918, which represents FPS employees nationwide. I'm also an inspector with the Federal Protective Service since 1986. Federal employees and facilities are very vulnerable to attack from both criminal and terrorist threats. Are they as secure as they should be? They are not. Is that security as effective as this congressional office building? Definitely not. Solutions include accountability for FPS leadership, pushing staff to the field, effective on-site security, and effective tools for risk assessment and recruiting. Regarding the culture of accountability, in 2010-2013, GAO reported problems with guard screener training and certification requirements. There's no excuse for these failures. 3 years later, they should have been fixed, and the responsible managers should have been held accountable. However, often lost in the broad brush of GAO reports, these are not organization-wide failures. In several of 11 FPS regions, almost everything seems to go well. Guards receive FPS training. Untrained guards are not used for screening. Firearms qualification is monitored, and guards are trained on active shooter scenarios. In these regions, tenants trust FPS to deliver. For these FPS field employees simply refuse to fail. FPS appeared to treat these failures as a structural issue to be solved by reorganization. This resulted in an unclear direction funneled through an extra layer of management who either ignored or missed problems. DHS, aided by your oversight, should remove the extra layer and fire or demote managers who failed to accomplish critical tasks or uphold the FPS Code of Conduct. Building security is not a T-ball game to build self-esteem. It's serious business with serious consequences. Regarding the shift of staff to where service is delivered, the federal law enforcement officers who deliver incident response, arrest offenders, and deliver assessments and guard monitoring are short-staffed and struggle to get it all done. Allocation of 68% of total staff to field law enforcement is not indicative of a lean, agile, and high-performing organization. An organization with less than 1,400 employees that has 8 senior executives, 39 GS-15, and 138 GS-14s, with over half of these assigned to headquarters, is top-heavy. The remedy is Congress should establish a ceiling for SES, limit GS-15s to 125% of the number assigned to the regions at headquarters, and mandate reduction of headquarters to 12.5% of total FTE. Also allow FPS to use building-specific charges to add FTE when officers are dedicated to the facilities paying the charges, and restore the minimum field law enforcement staff to its 2007 equivalent of 1,150. Regarding effective on-site security services, unlike the Senate and House office buildings where the on-site force is comprised of federal police officers, GSA facilities rely on contract guards for this function. FPS guard contracts do not use economies of scale to reduce hourly cost. The size of the FPS procurement staff has doubled, but now takes 400 days to implement a new contract. Our remedy, take action to direct the use of federal police officers for large multi-tenant facilities that are open to the public, and provide direction to efficiently consolidate guard contracts within the same state or contiguous areas. Also mandate a reasonable procurement staffing model and mandate cost-effective procurement options such as a potential use of GSA. Regarding effective tools for recruiting and risk assessment, FPS currently uses an interim risk tool called MIST. The GAO recently found it was not compliant with the government-wide standards and that there are available tools that do. Remedy is to mandate FPS expeditiously acquire and field a compliant risk tool. Regarding retention and recruiting, when applicants for federal law enforcement look at FPS, one of the questions is that, are we covered by law enforcement retirement? When told we are not covered by law enforcement retirement, the best and the brightest start looking elsewhere. At the National Law Enforcement Memorial, where the names of U.S. law enforcement officers who have died in the line of duty are inscribed, we recognize the supreme sacrifice of those heroes. Among the names inscribed at the memorial are 6 officers of the Federal Protective Service who died in the line of duty. Should any other FPS officer die in the line of duty, their name will be added to that list. If we live and die as law enforcement officers, Congress should recognize that service by allowing us to retire as one. Thank you for the opportunity to testify at this important hearing. Dedicated officers in FPS and the employees in federal facilities await your expeditious action on these serious matters.
Thank you for your testimony, Mr. Wright. Mr. Amate, you may proceed.
Thank you, Chairman Barletta. Chairman Barletta, Ranking Member Carson, my name is Stephen Amate, and I'm the Executive Director and General Counsel for NASCO, the National Association of Security Companies. NASCO is the nation's largest contract security trade association, whose member companies employ more than 300,000 security officers across the nation, servicing commercial and governmental clients. Since its founding in 1972, NASCO has worked with legislatures and officials at every level of government to put in place higher standards and requirements for security companies and private security officers. NASCO member companies provide security officers to numerous federal agencies, including the majority of the Protective Service Officers, or PSOs, under FPS. Not counting the military services, there are approximately 35,000 contract security officers across the federal government, and the use of contract security is an effective and cost-efficient countermeasure for safeguarding federal facilities, employees, and visitors. Over the past several years, the GAO has identified challenges that FPS faces in its missions to keep federal facilities secure, including issues related to the PSO program. And NASCO has been working with FPS, Congress, GAO, and GSA to address these issues. While the pace of progress on some issues may not be as fast as GAO would like, progress is being made. And since the appointment of Director Patterson in 2010, the degree of dialogue and breadth of cooperation between FPS and its security contractors has been unparalleled. There is no doubt that Director Patterson and others at FPS are committed to improving the PSO program, and FPS and NASCO are currently working together on a variety of initiatives that will improve the PSO program. To address deficiencies in FPS's capability to provide the crucial X-ray and magnetometer training to PSOs, FPS has just launched a pilot program conceived with NASCO that is training and certifying security contractor instructors to provide the PSO X-ray and magnetometer training. Also, this training has recently been revamped and expanded by FPS. In the area of active shooter training, NASCO has met several times with FPS to discuss FPS development of new active shooter training for PSOs, an effort which is definitely on the fast track at FPS. And FPS is wisely looking at what other agencies are doing with their active shooter training for contract security officers that they utilize. NASCO is also working with FPS on revising and standardizing PSO training lesson plans, and FPS envisions, as recommended by the ISC and GAO, of having all PSO training instructors certified. In other PSO program areas, FPS just came out with a much-needed revision of the PSO manual. Called the SMART Book, it governs and instructs PSOs on how to act, and not following the SMART Book is considered a contract violation. Of note, there is a new chapter on active shooter response. There's better language on the issue of PSO authority. And most importantly, by design, the format of the Smart Book will allow for making revisions as needed. FPS is also undertaking a comprehensive review of PSO post orders and seeking ways to improve its management of PSO training and certification data. For this latter effort, NASCO strongly recommends that FPS explore commercially available technologies and work closely with its security contractors who have to provide and upload the data. One PSO subject area that continues to present challenges is a PSO's authority to act and liability for acting in preventing or responding to an extreme situation such as an active shooter. On this issue, Congress should consider providing DHS with statutory authority to authorize PSOs to make arrests on federal property. Such arrest authority is already provided to contract security officers at other federal agencies. And there are also other elements of the federal facility risk assessment and security process not related to PSOs that need to be addressed. Take, for example, as has already been discussed today, the decision to implement specific security countermeasures for a facility. In GSA-owned or leased buildings, FPS is responsible for conducting the facility security assessment and recommending countermeasures, but the decision to implement those recommendations is solely up to the facility's security committee, which is made up of representatives from the facility's tenant agencies. However, as GAO has found, quote, tenant agency representatives to the FSC generally do not have any security knowledge or experience, but are expected to make security decisions for their respective agencies. And with tightened budgets putting pressure on tenant agencies to accept more risk, it calls into question whether FSCs are actually making informed risk-based decisions. Countermeasures deemed necessary for security should not be rejected because of either a lack of understanding or an unwillingness to fund them. And last Congress, NASCO supported legislation that required training for FSC members and allowed DHS to challenge a decision not to implement countermeasures. In closing, NASCO looks forward to continuing to work with FPS, Congress, GAO, and GSA to find ways to support FPS's mission to render federal property safe and secure for federal employees, officials, and visitors in a professional and cost-effective manner. Thank you.
Thank you for your testimony, Mr. Amate. I'll now begin the first round of questions, limited to 5 minutes for each member. If there are any additional questions following the first round, we'll have additional rounds as needed. Mr. Wright, you highlight in your testimony challenges with the staffing and a number of law enforcement officers. You point out 67 law enforcement officers are assigned to headquarters. Do you know if they are assigned to FPS headquarters or other parts of DHS?
Those 67 are assigned to FPS headquarters, and the point being that those individuals do not respond to law enforcement calls for service on a daily basis. In my mind, they don't meet the definition of field law enforcement staff.
Mr. Wright, you mentioned the delegation of law enforcement authority of buildings to entities outside of FPS and the duplication of security services at other agencies. Can you explain and how does this duplication impact the security of federal facilities and the chain of command?
Well, of course, most recently was the issue with the NAC, in which...
Can you pull the mic a little closer to yourself? Thank you.
Yes. Most recently, of course, the issue with the NAC, in which Office of Security staff took control of NAC security. Recently, in past years, Immigration and Customs Enforcement has stood up their own security unit. They use H.R. 1315 as their authority, and they assess their ICE buildings across the U.S. It is duplicative in nature. FPS conducts those surveys, and so does ICE. And that's probably the most recent example besides NAC.
Mr. Amate, you highlight in your testimony differences between how FPS oversees and manages its contract guards as compared to other agencies. For example, you highlight DOE and the U.S. Marshals. What do those agencies do differently in terms of the authorities and training they provide to their guards?
excuse me, the major difference is that with their contract security officers, they have authorized them to be able to make arrests on the federal properties where they are employed. This is statutory authority granted to DOE through an act of Congress, and that is something that we'd like to see considered by Congress for the PSOs at FPS. In addition, though, sir, there would be also additional training that would be required with that additional authority.
Mr. Wright, have you looked at how private contractors have been used to provide security at DOE, the U.S. Marshal Service, and even at DOD to identify how FPS can better utilize and train its guards to improve security at federal buildings?
Of the three agencies that you cite, DOD, DOE, and Marshal Service, I work most closely with the U.S. Marshal Service, so I can cite experience there. The contract security officers in these federal courthouses are all hired as former law enforcement. They've all been through some sort of law enforcement academy, and I'm unsure. They are deputized by the U.S. Marshals who have that authority. They are an effective force in the U.S. courthouses, and I think it's that ability to deputize by the marshals that's most important.
Mr. Amate, yeah, you mentioned that most of the other federal agencies that use contract security officers contract with security companies to provide training. Can you provide us with some examples of what other agencies are doing in that regard, and how they could be applicable to FPS?
Sure. Like, for instance, DOE, they require that the contract security companies that they contract with to provide all the training for the contract security officers there. The training is very comprehensive. It involves weapons training. It involves use of intermediate force, basic training, and all of that training. And at many of the agencies, the training that's provided to contract security officers is done by instructors who are certified, and also they are responsible for 100% of the training. A big issue at FPS is that for some reason FPS has held back the authority to provide the X-ray magnetometer training, and because of personnel resource issues, as Mr. Goldstein pointed out, sometimes that X-ray magnetometer training is not provided to the PSOs.
Thank you. And the Chair now recognizes Ranking Member Carson for his questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Wright, what is the FPS's relationship with the Facilities Security Committee from the union's perspective, and do you believe that the committees generally rely on FPS's expertise when evaluating recommendations for countermeasures?
As an inspector, I've worked with differing facility security committees across the government. Firstly, it's a matter of how serious the agencies take that facility security committee. If it's a smaller property with fewer agencies, even less budget, they don't tend to take those facility security committee recommendations seriously. FPS is the experts at the table for the most part. As you go up in the size of buildings, you have more tenants, more agency heads. These committees tend to, like any other, in some cases, undesirable task, it becomes a collateral duty. My experience is that when it becomes a collateral duty, or especially when agency funding is not available for security, then it's the recommendations don't make it through. No matter what an inspector says, these issues, these countermeasures are not going to be funded. And that's the primary problem with facility security committees is no agency is funded for security countermeasures.
Mr. Amate, How often are members of your association fined or penalized for not having proper documentation for their contract guards? And also, to your knowledge, sir, has any contract guard company working with the FPS been debarred for not fulfilling their contractual duties?
In terms of the information on the rate or the amount of times that contractors have been fined for not having officers who have their training and certifications, that I don't have that information. But NASCO, we fully believe that in those situations that proper action should be taken. I think that contractors, they have to pay back for the hours they're provided. Then there's also monetary fines, and then also it should affect their performance rating for potential future contracts. You know, we have no problems with FPS being able to enforce the provisions of the contract against contractors, but I think an issue is how this, you know, who has the right data. You know, one company has data, and then it's got to provide it to FPS, and FPS's data management system is very problematic. But definitely, if there are PSOs being put on post who don't have the trainings and certifications in violation of the contract, that company should be held in violation of the contract and punished.
Thank you, sir. Lastly, Mr. Wright, how does the lack of recognition of FPS officers as law enforcement officers for purposes of retirement after retention, recruitment, and morale of officers, clearly it has an impact, but is it substantive enough that we need to look more deeply into this?
It affects in the sense that sometimes you have law enforcement officers past the age of the minimum or the mandatory retirement of 57 years old. You tend to have officers that stick around perhaps a lot longer than they should for their own safety and for the public safety.
Sure. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back my time, sir.
Mr. Wright, what is the current protocol to respond to an active shooter in a federal building where an FPS officer may not be on the scene? And can you walk us through the role of the contract guard in that scenario?
Contract guards are limited by their post orders, which are basically subscribed by their private contract. The contracts spell out what services will be provided. That is translated to what the facility needs and goes into the post orders. Generally, guards do not leave their post. Guards are responsible for maintaining that post, locking doors, letting the tenants out and letting the good guys in to come to pursue the active shooter. But generally, these guards will not leave the post, and that's per post orders and basically per contract, which is also tied to state and locality issues with their authority.
So in a scenario where an active shooter got by a guard, maybe on another floor, and begins shooting, the guard doesn't leave his post. There's no authority that guard would have to do other than to wait for help.
Correct. Technically, the guard should not leave that post. In some federal buildings, you do have a rover, which is not tied to a post, but those are few and far between. What's going to happen when it happens? We have a lot of good security officers in the field. I think just like any law enforcement officers, individuals are going to do what they have to do. And then you face the consequences of what comes after.
Mr. Amate, you highlight in your testimony the steps FPS has taken to improve post orders for the guards at federal facilities. Are those orders clear on what is expected and what the authorities are of the contract officers?
They're getting better at providing that. One thing that we've emphasized with FPS is that those post orders need to be facility specific, and they need to be tailored to the building. But they in this review, they are trying to provide better instructions and guidance to the PSOs, and that includes now this recent issuance of a new PSO manual. And I would just like to just respond or just to comment on that last question. I would note that in 2010, there were 3 active shooter incidents involving federal facilities. And one was at the Holocaust Museum, one was at the Pentagon, and one was at a federal courthouse. In all 3 incidents, an active shooter came in and had a gun and started shooting at the personnel, security personnel on duty. In all 3 incidents, the active shooter was neutralized. 2 of those incidents, the security personnel were contract security officers. In one of the incidents, it was a law enforcement officer. So the PSOs, they do have the guidance and instructions to engage an active shooter and protect self and third parties. And that goes to the issue of the state law and the state powers. And under most state licensing laws, an armed security officer definitely has the authority to use his weapon to neutralize an active shooter.
Thank you. Chair recognizes Ranking Member Carson.
Thank you, Chairman. My last question. Mr. Amate, in your testimony, you indicate that members of your association use off-the-shelf technology to effectively manage your contract guards' training and certifications. Have you shared this technology with FPS, and if so, when? And have they indicated that they would use this technology? If not, why not?
That's a great question. I was actually talking with the PSO program manager the other day about this issue when I read in previous testimony about how FPS is working with the Science and Technology Division to prototype a guard tracking system, for lack of a better terminology, when those systems are commercially available. Now, I think some of the difficulty is in terms of the layers of security that FPS would need to put on its security officer certification and tracking data management system. But the bottom line is that whatever system they use, it's going to have to interface with the systems that are being used by the contract security companies. And there are, as Mr. Goldstein said, there are commercially available technologies that FPS might be able to use elements of those technologies on their side. But without a doubt, that is a big problem, and I think it can be solved, because there is no reason why there can't be a database management system where both the security contractors and FPS can access, upload data. The idea that security contractors are sending in paper forms and then FPS is manually uploading that just seems an anachronism. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Chair recognizes the gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Perry.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Question be directed to Mr. Amate. Am I pronouncing that correctly?
Yes.
Thank you. So it's my understanding that the Federal Protective Service has 4 alarm monitoring facilities, or mega centers, that monitor federal government security alarm accounts, one in Maryland, one in Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Colorado. The centers also have the law enforcement function of dispatching Federal Protective Service officers on emergency call. Now, has your agency ever done an analysis on what the overall operational cost is to maintain the 4 facilities, including staffing, and whether it would actually be more cost-effective for the taxpayer to move the alarm monitoring function to a commercial monitoring center?
We haven't looked into that, but the alarm monitoring is not an inherently governmental function, and so I think that is something that someone could look at. And that goes to, though, the issue of response. I mean, the PSOs when the PSO sees something or there's a problem, they should always contact the mega center unless there's an FPS law enforcement officer online. But in terms of the management and operation of those mega centers, whether it can be privatized, we have not looked at that.
Would that be something that you would seek to do from a cost-saving standpoint? Is there a concern that there would be a breach in security or a diminution of security by doing such a thing?
I think in this type of situation, whereas the FPS mega centers act more in a management function for FPS over the contract security officer force, I think that maybe FPS would want to retain control of that management function, but that's just something that we've never looked at.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you, and thank you for your testimony. Your comments have been helpful to today's discussion. If there are no further questions, I would ask unanimous consent that the record of today's hearings remain open until such time as our witnesses have provided answers to any questions that may be submitted to them in writing, and unanimous consent that the record remain open for 15 days for any additional comments and information submitted by members or witnesses to be included in the record of today's hearing. Without objection so ordered, I'd like to thank our witnesses again for their testimony today. I'm very concerned about what we have learned today. The FPS is directly responsible for protecting 1.4 million workers and visitors at federal facilities. We know by experience that federal facilities are targets. GAO has documented numerous security shortfalls over the years, and their recommendations remain largely incomplete. Yet rather than focus on department's efforts on addressing these problems and enhancing FPS, we learned the department has removed FPS from its lead security role at DHS's headquarters. We learned DHS has reassigned FPS's resources and staff for other purposes outside of protecting buildings, stretching already thin resources even thinner. And we learned DHS has taken law enforcement authorities for protecting federal buildings and delegated some of them to the department's security officer, to FEMA, to Immigration and Customs Enforcement, and the Federal Law Enforcement Training Center. Unfortunately, this looks a little like what we saw happen to FEMA. When FEMA was moved to DHS, DHS dispersed its authorities and responsibilities throughout the department, creating real confusion as to who was in charge for responding to a disaster. And we saw the results of that in the poor response to Hurricane Katrina. I hope that this is not what is happening here. But when I look at this May 1st memo, it says there is no clear unity of command at NAC. This is very disconcerting. Frankly, I wonder if we had the correct witnesses here from DHS, because it seems decisions are being made about FPS from somewhere else in the department, and it's not clear by whom. I expect we will have a number of follow-up questions as we assess what we have heard today. If no other members have anything to add, the subcommittee stands adjourned.